so that we can get over Salem, so we can say, you know what, this is what happened, we can get past this. And nobody's able to do it. And the really interesting thing about these attempts is it brings us back to these notions of guilt and innocence, because if the witches were innocent, then somebody had to be guilty of something somewhere along the way. So what people have done since that point is to look around, look at the cast of characters, using that phrase very deliberately, because the more we talk about it, the more it kind of becomes like this. And the language of play acting that was often kind of, has kind of been brought in to explain what was going on. But we get drawn in to this, and this idea of guilt and innocence, and the repetition really comes in, because it's like, well, if these people weren't guilty, then who was?
No, absolutely. Is there, absolutely. Is there, can you think of kind of an example of where that kind of desire to find someone wholly kind of innocent, to find some point where we can just like breathe a sigh of relief and just stop this thing? Is there a certain point or a certain figure that kind of, that kind of desire coalesces around?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Dorcas Good. So Dorcas Good was the 4-year-old daughter of accused witch Sarah Good. Sarah's one of the first 3 accused witches, and she was what we might think of horribly, but still as the typical witch. She was poor. She was a beggar, and people didn't like beggars in Salem. There wasn't a lot to spare for Christian charity, and also, Christian charity was not going to get them to heaven. Either they were saved or they weren't. And she smoked a pipe. Everything was wrong with this woman. And if she came to your house and asked you for food or lodging for the night, and you didn't want her staying in your barn because she might burn the barn down with a pipe, and you said no to her, she would go away muttering. And women's voices, women's speech was really kind of like demonized through this whole process. Sarah had a little daughter. She was believed to be an old woman, but it was just, a really, really tough life. Sarah had a little daughter, little Dorcas or Dorothy Good. She's generally known as Dorcas in most accounts of it. It seems that was a mistake. Her name was Dorothy, but it was used a couple of times in the accounts, and then it was kind of changed again. But Dorcas seems to be the name that has really kind of stuck with her. And the reason people talk about her a lot is because she was only 4. And she was accused of witchcraft soon after her mother was. And they asked her about her mother, and she said that her mother had 2 yellow birds, and that she herself had a little snake that would suck between the joints of her 3rd and 4th finger. And she showed the judges a little red spot, which apparently, with absolutely no irony, one of the reverends, John Hale, recorded beg your pardon, it's Deodat Lawson, recorded that looked like a flea bite. No irony in there at all. This is a little girl who sleeps in barns, and apparently she had something that looked like a flea bite. Well, who knew?
Who knew? Yeah.
Who knew? And little Dorcas Dorothy was imprisoned. Her mother was taken out and hanged, and she was left in the prison. This is, the perhaps most traumatic kind of part of the trials. They had to have chains made for her because she was so small that the chains wouldn't hold her. She was chained to the floor. She was left in prison for 9 months. Her father was really no use to anybody whatsoever, William Good. But eventually she got out. William didn't pay her bail. Somebody else paid it for her. And we know from William's claim for damages a few years later about the loss of his wife, the other child who was born in prison and who died there, and that Dorothy was so hardly used, he said, that she has no reason to govern herself. So from that we're reading that she suffered so much mental trauma that when she came out, by this point she was probably, I think, in her late teens or early 20s, that she was insane, and from that point she leaves the records. Mm-hmm. And the desire for an unassailable innocence tends to coalesce around her, because no matter how you argue it, you cannot be anything but horrified over the jailing of a 4-year-old child on a charge of witchcraft. And the girls cried out upon her. They said, look, they showed bite marks on their arms. Look where little Dorcas bit me. She tried to make me sign the devil's book. The chance of this child ever having seen a book in her whole little short life was really small. And it is hard to not use the language of innocence. And I do it myself.
Yes.
Little Dorcas.
Yes.
You know, you
pathos,
can't help but be drawn into pity for this child. But it's interesting that even though we want to focus on the unassailable innocence of this little girl and the horror of what happened to her, and therefore make her representative of a childhood innocence, that we can say, look, there it is right there. There are still writers who kind of trouble it, in a sense that and this is historians and fiction writers and poets who kind of use the figure of Dorcas in such a way that I feel kind of disturbs her own story. There are problems with this. I know it's a really difficult thing to negotiate. There's a fiction writer who wrote about her in terms and said at the age she was only 4, but her father had sent her out as a prostitute, and that she, you know, sent her out as a village prostitute. Her story wasn't horrific enough. Yeah. And that she was a witch, and you know, and in a way you might argue that she was trying to make it even more poignant, this story, but so disturbing. This was a book that I honestly, I had to go take a shower when I read it. It was awful. But again, that does also then put that innocence firmly back in place, doesn't it? And I find myself being pulled into this kind of counterflow, this identification with this child, much as I can see the issues with making her this figure of innocence. It's really hard not to be drawn in.
But that's surely the thing about this history then, isn't it? I mean, it's quite often in academic terms, we think about kind of repetition effects and reading effects and that sense that one is caught up and repeating what one attempts to, you know, clinically engage.
Yeah.
Often or sometimes what's missing from those accounts is the real fact that it actually works. You know, that you are hoisted on your own petard, that you are caught up in this thing. If it was less effective, you know, it would be much easier to do. And I think that I think that's one of the things that strikes me about the book, is that it is it's really exacting in its own reflexivity on its own positioning within this narrative, even as it's precisely it's working through that sense in which we cannot move on, but we are always caught in this thing. And it wants to identify that, but it's not, in the famous phrase, it's not sitting on top of the dung heap, you know, it is looking down. It is caught up, you know, it's caught up in all that danger and difficulty and emotion and all the rest of it.
Yeah, because it's really hard to kind of, it was a really tough book to write, you know, and there were times when I've been sat there reading these court transcripts of these children's testimonies, and I would kind of go back downstairs at the end of the day and I would be absolutely emotionally wrung out and exhausted. And a couple of times I was like, I'm not sure I can write this. This is really, really tough. And we get caught up in it, but I think it's important that we do, to some extent, to stand all the way back, to not engage emotionally with it at all. I think would be doing it a disservice. But I think it is important, exactly as you say, to reflect on what that means, on what that does.
And it's also that, you know, and the sense that actually, you know, a move to run towards it with open arms and saying, you know, that is also the problem. It isn't the problem that even as you are trying to stand back and to get that kind of distance, it's the acknowledgement that it returns even at a distance, isn't it? That's the thing. It's horrible. It is that, you know, with as you're saying about Dorcas, like even listening to this, is that sense that, you know, that the figure of the 4-year-old child, you know, one of the things that it kind of allows, doesn't it? Is that sense that maybe there is a scale, you know, if she's at the top, you know, then there must be someone at the bottom, right?
Oh yes.
But there also but there also must be someone second, you know, and like that is like it, and so you're in this bizarre position,
Yeah.
and that's one of the things, isn't it, about that drive to innocence, you know, as you're trying to remove someone from the scene, you know, there is a lingering finger pointing, you know,
Yeah.
at someone else who is I think I know the answer to this one. Who's at the bottom?
Abigail Hobbs.
Abigail Hobbs. Yeah,
Abigail
absolutely.
Hobbs, someone who was described by one of our fantastic speakers as her favourite of the accused witches. And I completely kind of get that. I really do. The fact that I gave her a chapter to herself. And she was tough to write about in entirely different ways, because Abigail was one of the accused. Yeah, she was accused of many things, and many of the accusations against her predated the trials by a couple of years. So depending on which source you believe, she was either 12 or 10. And when she was first kind of witnessed, or that she first started bragging, basically, that she had sold her soul to, quote, the old boy. And she would dance in the woods, and sometimes she would sleep out all night. She did a kind of fake baptism of her own stepmother, and you know, but she was also an accuser. She was one of the most prolific accusers as well, even from prison. She was one of the most prolific accusers. And the reason that she's kind of at the other end of the scale is when they interviewed her, she admitted everything. And not in a, oh God, I'm really sorry I did all of these things. Although she did say, you know, I've been really bad. I hope I shall be better. And then she kind of told, as I say, how she had sold her soul to the devil in Casco Bay in Maine many years before. And she'd sort of, said she was going to serve him for a certain amount of time, and that she'd tortured other people on his behalf, and he said that he would buy her like nice clothes and nice things and everything, but he didn't. But she kind of did this stuff anyway, and she confessed to murder. She confessed to multiple murders. She also implicated other people, and her testimony was so kind of shocking that the judges went back to her in jail a couple of days later to kind of say, are you sure? And she was like, really? Yes, and guess what else? You know? So she became kind of the figure. I mean, you know, as I say, it was difficult to know where to put a chapter on her, because she just did not fit in to kind of anything else. She was, you know, the most outrageous confessor. She also accused loads and loads of other people. And she was the only child, and it's difficult to say who precisely was and wasn't a child in Salem, but I think for the purposes of this argument, she was the only child who was convicted. And she was sentenced to be hanged. And as I said, by this point, she was either 14, most sources say 14, but she might have been 12. And she was sentenced to hang. And Cotton Mather, who wrote kind of, you know, lots about witchcraft and wrote about the trials and stuff, noted her not by name, but in terms of the date of the trials, that she was one of the people whose graves had already been dug. They were going to hang her, but it's a cancellation of the Court of Oyer and Termine that had been set up to kind of try all these cases that prevented her execution.
Well, that's really interesting. I mean, because there is in general, I think, a sense that the children of Salem are quite often sidelined. You know, yes. that they're not. When I think of my, you know, meager, you know, Abigail Hobbs, you know, but apart from that, you know, they tend to be pushed to the periphery. And I think one of the things that's handed down is this kind of like, you know, relieved sigh that, you know, no children were killed in the making of this kind of witch hunt. Yeah. But actually, you know, they're but by the grace of God.
Yeah.